October 9, 1942. High above a dense, green jungle island called Guadalcanal, 20,000 feet in the sky, an American pilot fought for his life. His name was Marion Carl. He was only 22 years old, flying a Grumman F-4F Wildcat, a heavy, stubby fighter plane that seemed too slow and too clumsy for the skies. Behind him, a Mitsubishi A6M0 stalked him, twisting and turning with lightning speed. The Zero was almost impossible to hit. It was light, agile, and deadly. For the past year, it had ruled the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. It was a ghost, a phantom, a nightmare for every American pilot who dared enter the Pacific air. Carl had fought many battles, but today felt different. His Wildcat, built for armor and firepower, felt sluggish. The Zero danced around him, anticipating every move. Carl dove hard, hoping speed would save him. The heavy American plane surged forward, but the Zero clung to his tail like a shadow. Cannons flashed. A sudden explosion ripped through Carl's cockpit. Metal shards tore at his leg. His controls went dead. The sky was no longer a battlefield. It was a trap. He bailed out, plunging toward the shark-infested waters below. Survival was a miracle. When he finally floated in the ocean, trembling and bleeding, he knew the grim reality of Guadalcanal. This was no ordinary fight. This was a meat grinder. The Cactus Air Force, as the American press called them, was slowly feeding pilots one by one into a war machine that showed no mercy. Henderson Field, the airbase Carl and his fellow pilots relied on, had earned a darker name among the men who lived there, the graveyard. Every day brought death. Dozens of young Americans, barely out of training, were sent to fly Wildcat fighters against Zeros. The doctrine was simple: never turn with a Zero. Dive, shoot, and run. It was the same rule that had guided the P-38 pilots back home. But the doctrine, clear and logical on paper, was failing spectacularly in the swirling chaos of Guadalcanal skies. Veteran Japanese pilots had fought over China, over Pearl Harbor. They knew how to bait the Americans, how to make the Wildcat's sluggish controls a death sentence. Pilots learned the hard way that a single miscalculation meant fire in the cockpit and sometimes death. Desperation hung in the humid jungle air, thick with the smell of oil, mud, and fear. Carl's story was far from unique. It was a common tragedy here. Every day Henderson Field received the broken and the dead. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, the men of the Cactus Air Force clung to hope. They were young, brave, and trained to fight, but the odds were against them. The Zero, a marvel of engineering, seemed unbeatable. And yet, even in this darkness, something extraordinary was about to happen. Across the Pacific, far from the jungles and battlefields, a farm boy from South Dakota was preparing for a journey that would change everything. His name was Joseph J. Foss. He was 27 years old, older than most of the pilots at Henderson Field. He had been told he was too old to fly in combat. He had grown up on a remote farm, hunting jackrabbits across frozen plains, learning to aim ahead of the target, not at it. His life had taught him patience, calculation, and precision, skills no military manual could teach. Soon, Foss would arrive at Henderson Field. He would step into a place that was more graveyard than airbase. He would climb into the same kind of Wildcat that had nearly killed Carl. But he would do something no one expected. He would not rely on doctrine. He would not turn to match the Zero. Instead, he would use something different, something simple but deadly, his own farmer's logic. The men at the graveyard did not know it yet, but a new kind of pilot was coming. One who had not been trained only in manuals or rules, but in the real, unforgiving school of life. One who had survived hunger, cold, and hardship. One whose simple trick, learned from chasing rabbits on a frozen farm, would change the skies over Guadalcanal forever. And so, as the sun set over the jungle island, and the wrecks of Wildcats and Zeros lay scattered across the airfield, a storm was coming. It was not a storm of clouds or wind. It was a storm of skill, courage, and cunning, led by a farmer who refused to die in the air. The battle for the skies was far from over. Death hovered over every pilot and chaos ruled the clouds. But soon, a single man would step into the fray and show the world that even the slowest, heaviest plane could be deadly if the pilot knew the secret. One farmer, one crazy trick, and a battle that would redefine air combat. Far from the smoke, fire, and chaos of Guadalcanal, on a remote farm near Sioux Falls, South Dakota, a young boy was learning lessons that no army could teach. His name was Joseph J. Foss. The year was 1927, and the farm was as harsh as life itself. Winters were long and cold, crops often failed, and every day was a fight for survival. For Joe, childhood was not about school or toys, it was about work, patience, and learning to survive. One of his first lessons came with a shotgun and a jackrabbit. The rabbits never ran in straight lines. They weaved, darted, reversed direction in an instant. Joe's father taught him a simple rule: don't aim at where it is. Aim where it will be. At first, Joe didn't understand. How could you hit a moving target by shooting at empty air? But soon he learned. He had to calculate lead, wind, and speed in a fraction of a second. By the age of 12, Joe could hit what others couldn't even see, using what would later be called deflection shooting. This skill, simple on the surface, was extraordinary. It was patience, observation, and instinct all combined. Every missed shot taught him something. Every rabbit caught honed his timing, his anticipation, and his focus. Joe was not just a boy hunting rabbits. He was training for a war he had not yet imagined. Yet life on the farm was unforgiving. His family struggled to survive the Great Depression. His father tragically died when Joe was 19, leaving him to run the farm alone. Education came late and hard. He took night classes while working dawn to dusk. Every dollar was earned, every achievement hard-won. But one dream never faded: flying. In 1933, at 18, Joe attended an air show with his father. He watched Marine Corps biplanes twist and turn above the fields, fearless and fast. Joe was mesmerized. "That's what I'm going to do," he told his father. Flying was freedom. Flying was purpose. But life had other plans. The farm demanded him. School demanded him. The world was harsh and dreams often had to wait. Even so, Joe worked tirelessly. He washed dishes to pay for flying lessons. He studied every manual, every rule, every instruction. By the time the United States was drawn into World War II, Joe was 26. The war had begun and the Navy was calling men to fight in the sky. He enlisted, but the response shocked him. Too old. 27. Not fit for combat. They offered him a role as a flight instructor instead. For 9 long months, Joe trained young men who would be sent into the jaws of the Pacific War. He watched as students he taught became casualties, shot down by the very planes and pilots he would soon face. Anger grew in him, sharp as a knife. Rules could not cage him. Doctrine could not limit him. Joe knew he could survive where others could not. Finally, the Marine Corps gave in. Joe Foss, the farmer from South Dakota, was sent to advanced fighter training. His orders were clear. He was going into combat. Destination: Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. He was older, stronger, and, in many ways, wiser than the young men who had been fighting and dying for months. But he was also walking into a living nightmare. When Joe arrived at Henderson Field in October 1942, the sight that greeted him was horrifying. It was not a military base. It was a graveyard. The airfield was little more than a dirt strip carved from dense jungle. The smell of engine oil mixed with rotting vegetation and death. Everywhere, wrecked planes lay abandoned, their wings twisted, cockpits torn open, engines destroyed. The men who remained were exhausted ghosts, their faces yellow from malaria pills, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. And there was Joe Foss, a farmer. A man who had learned his lessons not in classrooms, not in manuals, but in the cold plains of South Dakota. He looked at his assigned plane, a Grumman F-4F Wildcat. The same plane that had almost killed Marion Carl. Heavy, slow, and clumsy. A flying coffin against the Zero. Yet for Joe it was more than a machine. It was a tool. A weapon. A chance to test the secret he had honed for years. Joe listened as the squadron's executive officer briefed him on the rules. Never turn with a Zero. Dive, shoot, and run. It was the doctrine that had been failing, the rule that had killed countless young men. Joe nodded politely, but inside, his mind was already racing. The jackrabbit. The lead. The deflection. Every lesson of his childhood was about to be tested against the deadliest plane in the world. That night, Joe Foss did not sleep. He studied the enemy, studied the plane, studied the tactics. He visualized the skies over Guadalcanal, the jungle canopy below, the sun glinting off the wings of Zeros as they dived from above. He imagined every turn, every dive, every impossible shot. He was ready. Not just to survive, but to change the game entirely. This was the birth of a new kind of fighter. Not trained in Washington doctrine. Not relying on theory. But trained in instinct, observation, and simple, deadly logic. A man who could predict movement, anticipate danger, and strike where the enemy did not expect. Joe Foss, the farmer, was about to become a nightmare for the Japanese pilots who thought the Wildcat was a weak, easy target. And so the stage was set. Guadalcanal was waiting. The Cactus Air Force was waiting. The Zeros, confident in their skill, were waiting. But no one was ready for the farm boy who had mastered the art of shooting jackrabbits. One simple trick, one lifetime of preparation, and the air war in the Pacific was about to change forever. October 1942. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath a small transport plane, carrying a man who seemed ordinary but was anything but. Joseph J. Foss, 27-year-old farmer from South Dakota, stared out at the horizon, the weight of what awaited him settling in. Ahead lay Guadalcanal, a green jewel in the vast blue, but this jewel was wrapped in fire, smoke, and death. The island's jungle was thick, oppressive, and alive with danger, while above it the skies had become a battlefield. Foss had trained for years, learned every rule, every trick, every tactic. But nothing could fully prepare him for the reality awaiting him on the airstrip known as Henderson Field. What the other pilots called the graveyard, a place where dreams and lives had been shredded by Japanese Zeros. The moment the transport landed, the smell hit him. It was thick, almost choking, a mix of engine oil, rotting vegetation, sweat, and death. The landing strip itself was little more than dirt and gravel, pockmarked by craters and scoured by countless landings under fire. Broken wings and shattered fuselages littered the field like fallen soldiers on a battlefield. Foss looked around, taking in the twisted metal of F-4F Wildcats, P-39s, and countless other aircraft. Each wreck told a story. Each told a story of death, of young pilots who had never returned. The men who remained were shadows of youth. Faces yellowed by atabrine, the anti-malaria drug, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, and bodies weary from combat that never seemed to end. These were the veterans of Henderson Field, ghosts of the Cactus Air Force. They had seen their friends die in midair, in a fireball, in the unforgiving Pacific. And now, into their midst walked Joe Foss, a man older than most, carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had survived far harsher battles. The frozen plains of South Dakota, the cruel hand of the Depression, the death of a father, the struggle to earn an education, and the patience of a lifetime hunting jackrabbits. He was new meat and everyone knew it. The men looked at him with cautious eyes, their gazes measuring the farmer's resolve, questioning if he would survive longer than a week in the hell that was Guadalcanal. Foss's assigned plane, a Grumman F-4F Wildcat, awaited him. Heavy, slow, awkward in the hands of most pilots. This was the same type of plane that had nearly killed Marion Carl just days earlier. Yet Foss saw potential where others saw a death trap. The briefing came next. The squadron's executive officer, Duke, recited the doctrine that had guided them, and killed so many. Never turn with a zero. Dive, shoot, and run. Stay alive. Foss listened, nodded, but in his mind the rules seemed inadequate. He thought back to the frozen plains, the weaving jackrabbits, and the lessons that could not be found in manuals. Turning, diving, running, it was not enough. To survive, one had to think differently. One had to anticipate, predict, and strike before the enemy even realized what was coming. The first night in his tent was restless. Foss could hear the distant hum of engines, the crackle of gunfire in the air, and the ever-present fear that hung over Henderson Field. He studied maps, diagrams, and accounts from pilots who had barely survived previous battles. He visualized Zeros diving from the sun, Wildcats struggling to keep pace, tracers cutting through the sky like deadly threads. He imagined every angle, every move, every split-second decision that could mean life or death. By dawn, Foss was ready. The sun rose over the jungle, casting long shadows over the battered airfield. The men of the Cactus Air Force gathered, readying their planes for another patrol. Foss climbed into his Wildcat, muscles tensing as he gripped the controls. The cockpit felt heavy, almost cumbersome, but he was not intimidated. He remembered the jackrabbits. He remembered the lessons of anticipation and timing. As he taxied down the dirt strip, dodging craters and debris, he noticed the eyes of his fellow pilots. Some were skeptical, others curious. No one expected much from the farmer. But Foss's focus was elsewhere. He was thinking about strategy, about tactics, about using the limitations of his plane as a strength rather than a weakness. The radio crackled and the patrol took off. The sky opened before him, vast and merciless. Within minutes, the enemy appeared. Mitsubishi Zeros, sleek and deadly, emerged from the sunlight like shadows given life. Foss's heart beat fast, but his mind was calm. He remembered the advice his father had given decades ago: aim where it will be, not where it is. As the Wildcat climbed into the battle, Foss's approach was unconventional. He did not panic. He did not follow doctrine blindly. Instead, he calculated, anticipated, and prepared. Every move of the Zeros, every twist and dive, was anticipated. Every pull of the trigger, every burst of .50 caliber rounds, was calculated for maximum effect. The battle above Guadalcanal that day was chaos. Planes twisted, rolled, and dove in a deadly dance. Tracers flew through the sky like lightning. Explosions erupted, leaving smoke trails and burning wreckage in their wake. But amidst the chaos, a new pattern emerged. Foss moved differently, thought differently, fought differently. He was no longer a farmer in a plane. He was a predator in the sky, using his unique understanding of motion, anticipation, and timing to survive, and to dominate. By the time the patrol returned to Henderson Field, Foss had survived his first real test. No kills yet, perhaps, but he had lived. And more importantly, he had done it using his own rules. The men of the Cactus Air Force watched him land, alive and unscathed. There was a glimmer of respect, curiosity, and hope. Perhaps this new man, older and unconventional, could survive where others had failed. That night, Foss reflected on what lay ahead. The Wildcat was slow. The Zeros were fast and deadly. The doctrine was flawed. But the lessons from a frozen South Dakota farm, the skill of anticipating movement, and the courage to trust his instincts were his greatest weapons. Guadalcanal had seen many pilots come and go, most never to return. But a new force had arrived, one that would change the battle for the skies forever. One farmer, one mind sharpened by life, and one simple but deadly trick. The graveyard had a new visitor. And the sky would never be the same again. The morning sun broke over Guadalcanal, casting pale light over Henderson Field. Joseph J. Foss, 27-year-old farmer turned pilot, climbed into his Grumman F-4F Wildcat. The plane was heavy, slow, and clunky, the kind of aircraft that terrified young pilots facing Zeros in the Pacific. But Foss was not afraid. His mind was calm, sharp, and focused. Every lesson from the frozen plains of South Dakota, every calculation from years of hunting jackrabbits, prepared him for this moment. This was not a training flight. It was a trial by fire. The Cactus Air Force was on edge. Every pilot who had taken off before him had faced the ruthless Japanese fighters, and many had not returned. Foss adjusted his straps, checked the instruments, and felt the Wildcat's engine roar to life. He was about to enter the kill zone, a place where death came swiftly and mercilessly. As the flight rose to 15,000 feet, the radio crackled. Bandits. 11 o'clock high. Foss's eyes scanned the sky. And there they were, a formation of Mitsubishi Zeros, sleek, fast, and deadly, diving from the sun like shadows of death. The young pilots in the squadron tensed. Some swallowed hard. Some gripped the controls like they were holding on to life itself. Foss's heart beat steadily. He did not panic. Instead, he recalled the lessons of his childhood. Do not aim at the target. Aim where it will be. Predict its movement. Anticipate. This was the principle of deflection shooting he had learned from hunting jackrabbits, and now it would be tested against the deadliest fighter plane in the world. A Zero swooped toward his wingman, guns blazing. The instinct of doctrine would have commanded a dive, a turn, or a retreat. But Foss ignored it. He rolled his Wildcat hard, not at the Zero but at the empty space where the plane would move next. He squeezed the trigger. His 6.50 caliber machine guns tore through the sky, sending a deadly stream of fire toward the path the Zero was predicted to take. The enemy pilot, focused on his prey, did not anticipate the Wildcat's move. The plane hit, wing ripped apart, engine ablaze. It spiraled into the Pacific, vanishing in a cloud of fire and smoke. Foss's first kill. A predator in the sky, not by brute speed or turning skill, but by prediction, calculation, and patience. The other pilots watched in awe. Some gasped. Some whispered. The farmer had not only survived, he had killed. He landed back at Henderson Field, hands steady but mind racing. The ghosts of the Cactus Air Force gathered around him. Faces once pale with fear now showed a flicker of hope. But the danger was far from over. Guadalcanal was unforgiving and the Japanese pilots were relentless. Foss knew this. Each sortie could be his last. The sky was a battlefield where seconds decided life or death. Yet, in those first hours he discovered something crucial. The Wildcat, heavy and slow, could become a deadly weapon if used intelligently. Doctrine could only take a man so far. Instinct, skill, and observation could take him farther. The following days tested him relentlessly. Japanese Zeros attacked with precise coordination, diving from the sun, climbing like rockets, and baiting American pilots into fatal turns. But Foss had learned a new kind of fighting. Anticipate, do not follow. Lead, do not chase. Every burst of machine gun fire was aimed not at where the enemy was, but where he would be. Every maneuver was calculated to maximize advantage and minimize exposure. October 16th brought another intense engagement. Foss led 8 Wildcats into a formation of 32 Japanese aircraft. It seemed like suicide. But he was undeterred. He instructed his men to use the thatch weave, a tactic where pilots flew in pairs covering each other's tails. Foss Dove rolled and fired using his jackrabbit logic. The enemy was confused. Zeros that expected easy kills found themselves suddenly trapped in streams of lead, blown apart before they could react. By the end of the sortie, Foss had secured multiple kills, and his men had survived with minimal losses. The patrol returned to Henderson Field victorious. The graveyard for once had become a place of triumph. The farmer's instinct, refined over years of hunting and hardship, had turned the tide for a small band of pilots. The other men began to notice a pattern. This new pilot fought differently and it worked. Foss's first successes were more than just kills, they were lessons in survival and innovation. He had shown that doctrine was not absolute. He had demonstrated that even the slowest, clumsiest plane could dominate the sky if the pilot used intelligence, observation, and experience. More than that, he had inspired hope. The Cactus Air Force, weary and hunted, saw in him a glimmer of possibility, a new way to fight, a chance to survive and perhaps even to win. But Guadalcanal was cruel. Every victory came at a cost. Foss watched his squadron, understanding that every sortie carried risk. His eyes, steady and calculating, scanned the sky for the next threat. He had learned that fear could be weaponized, focus could be deadly, and that sometimes, survival required breaking the rules. By the end of his first week in combat, Joe Foss was no longer just a farmer from South Dakota. He was a predator in the Pacific skies, a man who had taken the lessons of hunting jackrabbits and turned them into the deadliest skill in the air. The Zeros had met someone they could not anticipate. The graveyard had found a fighter who could survive. And for the first time in weeks, the pilots of Henderson Field felt something they had not felt in a long time. Hope. Foss had survived. Foss had killed. And above all, Foss had learned the greatest lesson of all. In Guadalcanal, as in life, victory belonged to those who saw the world differently, who trusted their instincts, and who dared to fight against impossible odds. The Pacific sky waited. The Japanese pilots were unaware of the storm approaching. A farmer, armed with nothing but instinct, courage, and a deadly trick, was about to redefine the battle for Guadalcanal. By mid-October 1942, Joseph J. Foss had become more than just a survivor. He had begun to inspire fear, hope, and awe. Henderson Field, once a place where death hovered over every pilot, now had a glimmer of new strategy in the sky. Foss's first patrols had proven that the Wildcat, once considered a slow, heavy coffin against the Japanese Zero, could be deadly in the hands of a pilot who understood motion, anticipation, and instinct. But surviving alone was not enough. Foss needed to lead. The squadron of 8 Wildcats that Foss commanded was a mix of rookies and veterans, many of whom were shells of the men they once were. The air was thick with fear and tension, each pilot carrying the scars of previous battles. Some had seen friends torn apart midair, some had seen planes explode before their eyes. And into their midst stepped the 27-year-old farmer, a man who had never fought professionally before, yet moved with the confidence of someone who had lived through life-and-death situations far harsher than any air battle. Foss called his group the Flying Circus, a nickname given by the press as they watched the strange and daring tactics of the small squadron. Unlike conventional doctrine, Foss encouraged innovation. He taught his pilots to anticipate, to calculate, to lead their targets, just as he had done with jackrabbits back home in South Dakota. Turn fighting, the deadly bait used by Japanese pilots for months, was no longer the rule. Instead, the Wildcats moved unpredictably, weaving, rolling, and diving in patterns that confounded the enemy. October 16th brought the first test of this new approach. Foss led his 8 planes straight into a formation of 32 Japanese aircraft. The odds were terrifying. Every pilot knew that a single misstep could mean death. Yet Foss remained calm. He briefed his men on the new tactic, the thatch weave. Flying in pairs, they would cover each other's tails, creating overlapping fields of fire and reducing the chances of surprise attacks. The key, Foss explained, was discipline and anticipation. Every move had to be calculated, every gun burst had to be precise. As they climbed to 15,000 feet, the enemy appeared, Zeros diving from the sun, their engines roaring, guns ready. Foss led the first wave. He did not turn to follow, nor did he dive to escape. Instead, he rolled, angled, and fired at where the enemy would be, not where they were. The first Zero hit the invisible trap. Wing shredded, engine ablaze, it spiraled into the ocean below. One by one, the Flying Circus executed the weave, covering each other, striking unpredictably, leaving the Japanese confused and vulnerable. In less than 10 minutes, Foss's small squadron had downed 5 Japanese planes. Foss himself scored 2 kills. The survivors of the patrol, once haunted and fearful, returned with renewed morale. The graveyard was no longer just a place of loss, it was becoming a field of victory. Pilots who had doubted the Wildcats' abilities now believed in their leader, in his instincts, and in the farmer's logic that no manual could teach. Over the next week, Foss continued to refine his tactics. He trained his pilots not to panic, not to follow the traditional rules that had cost so many lives. Instead, they learned to lead, to anticipate, to strike with precision. His deflection method, born from hunting jackrabbits, became the basis for their attacks. The flying circus was no longer a ragtag group of misfits, they were a lethal machine, unpredictable, disciplined, and deadly. The Japanese forces began to notice a change. Pilots who had once fought with confidence now reported strange encounters. Wildcats no longer fled under attack. They rolled, climbed, and fired with deadly accuracy. Experienced Zeros were destroyed by pilots who seemed to anticipate every move, moving in ways that defied logic. Radio intercepts carried a single name, Foss. The enemy was bewildered. A farmer from South Dakota, piloting a heavy and slow Wildcat, was rewriting the rules of aerial combat. October 25th brought the most astonishing display of Foss's genius. Leading a patrol, he encountered a large formation of Japanese fighters. The odds were terrifying, but Foss's flying circus moved with precision. His pilots executed the weave flawlessly. Foss himself engaged multiple Zeros, anticipating their every maneuver. One by one, enemy planes fell, their engines destroyed, their wings torn apart. By the end of the engagement, Foss had downed 3 Zeros in a single day. His kill count grew and his reputation spread across the Pacific. The impact on morale was immediate. The men at Henderson Field, once hunted and fearful, now flew with confidence. They knew that even in impossible odds, there was a method to survival. They trusted Foss not just as a pilot but as a leader, a strategist, and a man who had transformed the battlefield with his insight. The Japanese pilots, once unstoppable, now approached engagements cautiously. Fear replaced confidence. The ghosts of Guadalcanal, as the enemy would call them, were no longer merely surviving, they were hunting. Foss's success was more than just personal achievement. It was a turning point in the air war over Guadalcanal. The tactics he developed, the deflection shooting, the thatch weave, the anticipation of movement, became the new doctrine for the Cactus Air Force. Dozens of pilots, once on the brink of despair, now had a fighting chance. The once feared Zero was no longer invincible. The heavy Wildcat, when flown with intelligence and skill, could dominate the skies. Yet the cost was never far from Foss's mind. Each victory meant more sorties, more exposure, more risk. He saw the exhaustion on his pilots' faces, the toll of constant battle, and the shadow of death that hovered over every engagement. The war in the air was brutal, unforgiving, and relentless. But Foss had learned the ultimate lesson. Survival and victory belonged not to the strongest, but to the smartest, the most disciplined, and the most fearless. By the end of October, Joe Foss and his flying circus had become legend. The graveyard was no longer just a place of despair, it was a symbol of resistance, innovation, and hope. One farmer, with nothing but his instincts, intelligence, and courage, had turned the tide in the skies above Guadalcanal. And the Japanese forces, once supreme, had discovered a new adversary they could not predict, a predator who could strike from anywhere at any moment. The Pacific skies had a new champion. The Cactus Air Force had a new leader. And the legend of Joe Foss, the farm boy who became America's ace, was only beginning. By November 1942, Joseph J. Foss was no longer simply a new arrival at Henderson Field. He had become a force that the Japanese pilots could neither predict nor defeat. The flying circus, once a ragtag group of misfits, now moved like a well-oiled machine under Foss's command. The tactics he had perfected, the thatch weave, deflection shooting, leading the target, were reshaping aerial combat over Guadalcanal. Yet for Foss, every victory was hard-earned, every sortie a personal test against fear, fatigue, and the ever-present threat of death. The battles came thick and fast. Japanese Zeros no longer dived with confidence. They approached cautiously, wary of the Wildcats that now struck unpredictably. Foss had become a ghost in the sky, a phantom that seemed to anticipate every movement of the enemy. And as his kills accumulated, so too did his reputation. By the middle of November he had already secured 15 victories, and the news spread among the pilots. One farmer, armed with nothing but skill, instinct, and courage, was rewriting the rules of the Pacific Air War. October had tested his ingenuity. November would test his endurance. The Japanese responded by sending their most experienced aces to intercept him. These were pilots who had fought over China, who had survived Pearl Harbor, who knew the limits of both plane and man. Yet Foss, fevered from malaria and exhausted from non-stop missions, met them head-on. The skies became a swirling melee of smoke, fire, and metal, each engagement more dangerous than the last. On November 7th, Foss led his flight against an elite formation of Japanese aces. 36 Zeros and bombers approached, their pilots confident that this would be the day the farmer would finally fall. Foss's Wildcat climbed into the chaos, weaving through tracers and explosions. His vision blurred from fever, his hands shaking slightly on the controls, but his mind remained razor-sharp. He rolled, dove, and fired not at the planes, but at the spaces they were predicted to occupy. Kill after kill, Foss's tally climbed. 2 Zeros destroyed within minutes, a third forced into the ocean, a fourth blown apart midair. His squadron followed his lead, covering each other, striking with precision, and surviving where others would have perished. By the end of that mission, Foss had personally downed 3 enemy planes, while his flight had accounted for 8. The Japanese began to whisper about the ghost of Guadalcanal, pilots who moved in impossible ways, striking without warning. The days blurred together. Foss flew mission after mission, often ignoring his body's pleas for rest. Malaria returned with a vengeance, fevers racking him, yet he refused to stay grounded. He knew the stakes. The island, the squadron, the war itself depended on pilots like him who could change the tide. By November 30th, he had scored 23 victories. Only 3 kills stood between him and Eddie Rickenbacker's American record of 26, an achievement untouched since World War I. January 15, 1943. The day Foss would become legend. A massive Japanese convoy, the largest he had ever seen, moved toward Guadalcanal, protected by a dense screen of fighters. The air erupted with engines, tracers, and the chaos of battle. Foss climbed into the cockpit, body trembling from fever but mind clear and focused. He remembered the lessons from the farm, the jackrabbits, the endless calculations of movement and timing. The first Zero appeared, swooping down on one of his wingmen. Foss rolled, aimed, and fired into the space where the enemy plane would move. Kill number 24. Another Zero tried to escape, climbing steeply into the sun. Foss anticipated the maneuver, lined up the deflection shot, and fired a perfect burst. Kill number 25. The pilots in his flight watched in awe, their leader moving with a combination of instinct and precision that seemed almost supernatural. The final kill, number 26, would cement his place in history. A Japanese float plane attempted to flee the battle, pulling into a desperate climbing turn. Foss calculated its path, raised the nose of his Wildcat, and let loose a stream of .50 caliber rounds at exactly the right moment. The plane disintegrated midair, tumbling into the ocean below. The unthinkable had happened. Joe Foss, farmer from South Dakota, had broken the all-time American record for aerial victories. Henderson Field erupted in celebration. Pilots lifted Foss from his cockpit, feverish, exhausted, and bleeding from countless minor injuries. He was a hero, yet to him the victory was not about fame, it was about survival, about proving that intelligence, instinct, and courage could overcome superior technology and experience. The Japanese, meanwhile, were stunned. Their doctrine, once unbeatable, had been undone by a single man's insight. The Zeros were no longer invincible, and the Cactus Air Force had proven it. Foss's triumph was more than a personal achievement. It reshaped the war in the Pacific. The tactics he developed became standard procedure, saving countless lives. Pilots who had once faced certain death now had hope, armed with strategies forged from a farmer's mind rather than a military manual. Yet the cost was immense. The war, the fever, and the constant danger had taken a toll. Foss was physically broken, yet his spirit remained unshaken. He had achieved the impossible, turning the tide in the skies above Guadalcanal, proving that one individual, armed with courage, skill, and ingenuity, could change the course of a battle, and even a war. On that day, January 15, 1943, a farmer became a legend. The Pacific skies, once dominated by fear, now carried the name Joe Foss, a symbol of ingenuity, bravery, and the relentless will to survive. The ghost of Guadalcanal had risen, and the Japanese aces knew that the hunter was now in command of the hunt. By early 1943, the skies above Guadalcanal had begun to shift. Japanese pilots, once confident and relentless, now approached engagements with caution, haunted by the name Joe Foss. Yet the toll of constant battle and fever was relentless. Malaria had returned with full force, shaking Foss's body with chills and exhaustion. After his 26th kill, the record-breaking flight that cemented his place in history, Foss was grounded. He was carried from his cockpit, a skeletal figure, sweat-soaked and trembling, yet still burning with determination. For weeks, he lay in the makeshift hospital at Henderson Field. The air smelled of disinfectant, medicine, and the damp of the jungle. Nurses and doctors worked tirelessly, trying to stabilize him as fevers racked his body. Foss, ever restless, could not stay idle. He paced his hospital room, thinking about the battles still raging, the pilots still in danger, and the Japanese planes still in the sky. Even confined to a bed, he remained the strategist, the predator, the leader who had changed the Pacific Air War. Letters arrived from Washington, from admirals and commanders who had been monitoring the Cactus Air Force. Reports of his bravery, his innovative tactics, and his unbroken spirit filled the inboxes of military leadership. Yet Foss remained humble. To him, the victories were never about fame, they were about survival, about proving that a determined individual could overcome impossible odds. He thought of his childhood farm in South Dakota, the frozen plains, the jackrabbits, and the endless lessons of patience, calculation, and courage. Those lessons had saved his life and the lives of countless pilots. On May 18, 1943, Joseph J. Foss would receive the highest recognition a soldier could achieve. Standing at the White House, he faced President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. The nation applauded, and the citation praised his dauntless courage, his unparalleled skill, and his heroic leadership. Foss, the farmer who had been told he was too old for combat, had become America's ace of aces. Yet fame did not change the man. Even as newspapers and radio broadcasts celebrated his achievements, Foss thought of the men he had lost, the planes destroyed, and the relentless danger that still awaited those flying over the Pacific. He had won battles, yes, but at great personal cost. His body bore the marks of war, fevers, weight loss, and the lingering effects of constant exposure to tropical diseases. Every medal, every accolade reminded him of the trials he had endured. After recovery, Foss returned to service, though never in the same intensity as the Guadalcanal campaigns. He trained new pilots, sharing his tactics and lessons. The thatch weave, the deflection shooting, the farmer's instinct, all became doctrine for the Pacific Fleet. Pilots who had once struggled to survive now had the tools to dominate the skies. Foss's influence extended far beyond his personal victories. He had changed the way America fought in the air. When the war ended, Foss returned to South Dakota. The farm called him back as it always had. He remained a national hero, yet he never sought the spotlight. Instead, he dedicated himself to service in other ways. He entered politics, using his fame and leadership to serve his state. Elected to the South Dakota legislature and later as governor, Foss continued to embody the values that had guided him through the skies of Guadalcanal: determination, courage, and a commitment to doing what was right. In 1954, Foss became the first commissioner of the American Football League, demonstrating the same strategic mind and leadership skills that had made him a legend in war. Yet even in these civilian roles he never forgot his roots. He remained the farmer from South Dakota, a man shaped by hardship, observation, and the relentless pursuit of mastery over his environment. The lessons from the frozen plains, the hunting fields, and the endless calculations of movement had never left him. They had simply found a new arena in which to shine. Joe Foss's story, like those of other extraordinary individuals of World War II, reminds us that wars are not won solely by technology, doctrine, or numbers. They are won by individuals who see the flaw, who trust their instincts, and who have the courage to act when others hesitate. Foss had faced the deadliest fighter planes of his time, the most experienced enemy pilots, and the harshest conditions imaginable. Yet he survived, adapted, and turned the tide. He had become a symbol of hope, ingenuity, and relentless courage. Foss died in 2003 at the age of 87. His funeral honored his extraordinary life, his service, and his unmatched skill as a pilot. Buried with full military honors, he remained a hero to the nation, a legend to the Marine Corps, and a testament to the unbeatable determination of the American farmer. His legacy lived on, not only in medals and records, but in the countless pilots who benefited from his lessons, the strategies he pioneered, and the inspiration he provided to generations. In the end, Joe Foss was more than a pilot, more than a hero, and more than a record breaker. He was a man who trusted his instincts, who used his mind as a weapon, and who proved that even the unassuming, the underestimated, and the seemingly ordinary could achieve extraordinary things. Guadalcanal had witnessed the rise of a legend, a farmer who taught the world that courage, intelligence and grit could change history. And so, the ghost of Guadalcanal remains immortal. A man from South Dakota had faced the deadliest skies, defied the impossible and emerged victorious. Joe Foss, the ace of aces, the farmer, the hero, had written a chapter in history that will never be forgotten.